Hi, Michaela.
Hello, Steve.
So today I'm going to be asking you more viewer questions related to the theme of intimacy and the erotic.
Great.
The first question is, what is the journey to a full body, heart-fulfilling orgasm? Is love essential for it?
Oh, that's a nice question. Okay, let me start somewhere else and then make my way towards that question, right? Because in general, when we look at pleasure and all the kind of systems and principles that are involved in having full body pleasure, there's different aspects that we can look at, right? So most people, when they think of orgasm, they just think of a special technique or a certain way of touching the body, or certain toys or certain partners, certain positions that give them sexual pleasure. And that's certainly true, and that's certainly a whole area of exploration. I think we'll talk probably at some point more about that, because we had some questions about that. So when we look at full body orgasm, we're looking at more than just skill or touching certain spots. Because it's full body, we're looking at the body being both sensitized as well as having a certain conductivity that allows for pleasure to be felt everywhere. And that's a really interesting exploration, because of course full body orgasms can be reached in other ways than in sex. And many people do have what they call full body orgasms during different occasions than sex, like in nature, for instance, right? Or while doing spiritual practice, or while dancing, or things of that nature. So when we look at that kind of idea of the entire body becoming alive and enlivened and pleasurable and ecstatic, we're looking at what makes the body ecstatic, which I think is really kind of an interesting exploration in general. What makes the body ecstatic? What makes us that lit up and that open? And so there's a few components to that. And the first component, of course, is the body in itself and embodiment. And then the next component is the activity that brings on that particular, really just beautiful opening. And then also, as the questioner is asking, the love aspect, the heart aspect. And then there's an aspect beyond that, kind of an X factor, because some people report that they sometimes have these full body experiences without any warning or anything that they're doing, which can also happen. So, but when we look at the body, what we're looking at is essentially the energetics of the body being such that that's possible. And I want to say about that, some people have it spontaneous, or some people have experiences that are brought on by other people. What we are talking about now is being able to kind of reliably and joyously have that experience by yourself or with your chosen partner in the way you want to. So where you actually are able to reproduce that, and it's not that thing that just happened out of the blue. So for that, the body has to be somewhat open, and the body has to be having some kind of an ability to conduct energy throughout the entire body. And so when people talk about sexual yoga, right, or yogic sexuality, they often talk about the systems, the energy systems in the body. And in different traditions, there's different ways to look at that. Typically, it involves channels, and sometimes it also, involves meridians. And there's kind of energetic systems that are described by different traditions that play into that. So in the kind of sexual yoga world, often there's a lot of heavy breathing involved, or specific breathing to certain areas in order to open channels, so to speak, right? And some people squeeze sequences of, locks and things like that. But if you don't want to down that route of, very formal practice, the thing to know, and the thing that is very easy to engage with is that there's essentially a central channel through the body, energetically speaking, that you can feel quite easily when you sit or move, where there's either contraction or openness kind of through the center of the body. And it kind of runs parallel to all the areas of the body that tend to get somewhat clenched. So without going into too much detail, when we look at the front line of the body and then behind that, kind of on the inside of the body, we are looking at areas that tend to get somewhat contracted. And one of the reasons they get contracted is because as humans, we are mammals, and as mammals, we have all the organs, essentially behind the front surface of the body, but we're the only creatures who are not protecting that. All other mammals lean forward and they protect the soft front surface of their body. And as most people know in dogs, right, when they go submissive, they show the areas that would be easy to attack, the soft areas. And we show our soft areas all the time. So we typically have areas of clenching and protection around those in general. And then, of course, if we've been hurt or if we had injuries or things like that, those clenches and areas get even tighter. So you don't need to know much about, let's say, the channels and the chakras and all of that. You can just feel where in your body is tension and clench. And typically it's on the front line of the body, and then behind that, kind of on the inside, the solar plexus, and all the way up the head and down into the perineum. So that area, when it's tight for whatever reason, clenched, protected, injured, bad posture, pain from some loss or grief, all of that kind of goes into that area. And the tighter that area goes and the more clenched it goes, the less conductivity there is. So that's one thing. And then, of course, when you engage more in yogic sexuality, you're looking at certain locks. There are certain areas in the body, the throat, the solar plexus, and then on the base of the body, where with the pelvic floor, where we can hold too tightly or not tightly enough, right? Where the energy can leak out or the energy can get stuck. So that all said, when we look at full body pleasure, what we're looking at is our body open enough that the pleasure can rise from, let's say, the genital area up through the body and out the arms and down the feet and up into the head. And one of the things that anybody can do is kind of look at the areas where clench could happen and start playing with relaxing those areas, both actively relaxing, massaging, or getting a massage. Some people like to kind of dissolve tension when they meditate. Other people do specific exercises or yoga or breathing. We, of course, in our courses do nonlinear with people, nonlinear movement method with people, which was actually based on essential channel practice originally, many years ago when I started developing it. And that all allows those areas to open. And then it also allows the body to sensitize when you do that. And then you can feel where there's further contractions and where you might have a little bit of extra attention, like getting massages or somatic work, or just put attention there yourself so it can be relaxed. So that's one thing. And that's very important for all things pleasure, is that particularly the midline of the body, and particularly the areas of the solar plexus and the belly and the pelvic floor, are at least able to relax on occasion and able to open up, so that not only energy, we're talking energy, but we're also talking blood flow and all the things that happen physiologically to the body, so that we have, aliveness and arousal and pleasure in the entire body. So that's one thing that kind of needs to be established for full body pleasure, is a a body that can open. It doesn't always have to be open. We're all having moments of stress and tension and pressure and all of that, but it needs to be able to open. And for anything that can be reliably opened, you have to have a certain amount of practice, meaning you've done it in some way enough so that you can relax when you want to, or you can be pleasurable when you want to. So that's the one piece, right? Then, of course, the next thing is technique, so to speak, right? So when people talk about orgasms and they talk about sexual pleasure, there's a certain amount of technique involved, in the sense that you have to explore your own body and know what actually lights you up, turns you on, gives you pleasure in the more specific genital areas. And it's always good to do that, and always good to explore ways to have more pleasure of the sexual kind. And then there's, of course, also sensual pleasure, which I talk about a lot because it's one of those overlooked areas, that when you are allowing your senses to be involved in your pleasure experience, you're really amplifying and potentiating what's happening towards full body pleasure, because your five senses are, of course, the access to incredible perception and aliveness and pleasure. And so within skills there, you can learn how to touch your own body, and also you can learn how to touch your lover's body in ways that brings more pleasure and expands the pleasure. And that's also very, very important. And then the last part of what this question was about is, is love involved? And I would say the answer is yes, but love doesn't necessarily have to be love for that partner, even though that's also very nice, because the love for a partner and the love for the person you're with, of course, adds a whole other dimension to pleasure, because there is, of course, this beautiful feeling of your heart opening and softening, which in itself is kind of, sometimes you hear people talk about the heartgasm, right? That moment when your heart just opens. And often there's tears that come with it, tears of joy or tears of love, and it's this gooey, warm, incredibly pleasurable feeling of your heart opening. And the heart opening, once again, there's a guarding that we all do because we've all been hurt. And also it's important to not open oneself to people that you don't want to open yourself to for, and various reasons. But when the heart opens, and then what I mean by that is, it's always good to love, but sometimes a certain kind of a relational aspect is not possible or not advisable. So then we have to kind of protect ourselves somewhat. But that open-hearted love and that kind of connection to another human is incredibly precious. But when that's not there, there's always the love for all, the love, the universal love, essentially, the love of love itself, the love that we are, the love that we have for the divine, right? You hear these beautiful poems, that have been written for many, many centuries about the beloved, and the beloved there is the beloved with a big B, so to speak, the divine beloved. And having that orientation towards the divine beloved in the middle of both sensual, sexual, and full body pleasure is definitely worth exploring, because there's a whole other dimension and a whole other possibility there of an openness and a transcendent, really just incredible openness that's worth exploring. So should one cultivate love and as part of that exploration, I think it's well worth it.
I'm wondering if you might say something a little bit more about these locks. You've mentioned locks that can release or contain energy. I'm wondering if you might say something about that. And also, part of the question was talking about, as you pointed out, heart fulfilling quality. And I know it's the case that in certain practices in this area, the heart is actively recruited and actually brought in deliberately. Feeling the heart, etc., meditating on the heart, and so on, is brought into the erotic encounter. So I'm curious what you think of those kinds of practices and what role they might have in the context of what you've said.
Yeah, I mean, of course, both you and I, when we teach together, right, very strongly encourage the heart and the connection through the heart before you even go to the erotic, simply because it's very important to keep the entire interaction anchored in a consideration for oneself and the other through the heart, right? And through that compassionate and loving center. So I think that's super important. And I think it's, something that you can't skip. Otherwise, you just rotely doing sex or using your partner to fulfill a certain kind of a desire you have to experience certain things. So we very often, when we do any kind of couples work, in workshops as well as in our private sessions, really lean heavily on feeling one's own heart, feeling one self as love, and then feeling the other person and connecting like that, and connecting body to body, heart to heart, eye to eye, as a means of making sure that there is that really strong orientation towards love and kindness and compassion and understanding, which is important, because once we start involving somebody else in our pleasure and sexually, there is, of course, a huge margin for error and failure and them not doing it right and disappointment and all kinds of things that have to do with our patternings and our expectations and our skill level and the other person's skill level. So it's always very, very important. And of course, the way I was taught in various ways, both in the psychological and in the yogic ways, it is the thing that comes before you go into the erotic, and it has a devotional quality to it. So it is very, very important. But when we look at full body orgasm, sometimes there isn't somebody else involved, right? Where you don't have to connect with a partner when you're practicing and when you're kind of engaging in that. So then it's more the universal love and the universal devotion and the universal ability to be love as a body, so to speak. But when another person is involved, that's super important. And then as far as the locks go, there is, very specific ways the body holds energy, so to speak. And we kind of know that because we are at the effect of that mostly when we do things like you and I are doing right now, meaning we're sitting and we're thinking and talking. And when we're, kind of doing things that require that our brain and our mind and our mouth and, the upper part of the body is very focused and very directed, then our energy, of course, has to be used for that. It has to do with energy conservation in the body. And what that typically means is that we pull available energy from the base of the body where it's not needed at that moment, because we're sitting in a chair, we're not walking, we're not doing anything with the lower body. So there's a certain kind of a tightening and the squeezing up and the, pressure in the lower body in order to use all that energy for thinking and doing. And when that happens more often than the other thing, which is pleasurable full body engagement, then it becomes a habit pattern. And so then we are habitually pulling up, squeezing up, locking it all in so we can use it, which is why a lot of people at the end of their day have tight neck and shoulders and clenching jaw and pressure in the forehead, because wherever energy is located, it will pool and you're holding it there. So with locks, we do it automatically, so to speak, right? We often, when we get frightened or when we're stressed or when we need the energy, squeeze the base of our body unconsciously, but sometimes even consciously. And we also squeeze our solar plexus as a means of kind of pushing through or using our will to get stuff done. And those are natural locks that exist in the body. The throat's another one. Sometimes you hear people, they get very hoarse, or they have a very hard time speaking up for themselves because they're very contracted here. So, it's energetic as well as physical. So these are apparent locks in the body that we are all aware of. And of course, you can use them and you can train relaxing those areas. And the more you kind of give the body authority to regulate, which is one of the big things when we talk about rewilding and coming back to what our body is capable of doing. Our body actually knows how to activate these locks and also knows when to let them go, but we're typically habitually clenched. And the problem with some of these yogic sexual practices, how they're often taught nowadays, is that you say this very nicely, right? You say tension over tension, right?
I think the line you're thinking about is actually a quote from one of my teachers, my yoga teacher, Godfrey Devereaux. And he says, papering tension over tension to give the illusion of openness. And sometimes he talks about that in the context of the breath. Sometimes breath practices or breath systems, they valorize a deep breath. The idea is that it's good to have a deep breath and so on, and criticize shallow breathing. There are many reasons why people breathe deep and shallow. One thing to say is that one doesn't always need to breathe that deeply. One doesn't always need that much oxygen. So one of the reasons one might not be breathing deeply all the time is because the body doesn't need it. But there are other reasons too, and there are times when there's tension in the respiratory muscles and in the body in general, which is in a certain sense restricting the ability of the body to breathe easily and as deeply as it would like. In that kind of a case, what can sometimes happen is when breath practices are done, which force an opening into the body using, say, a lot of tension, a lot of push to kind of open and get a deep breath, one's reinforcing in a certain sense or doubling down on that tension, or contributing maybe even to that kind of tension. So sometimes it's necessary to learn to relax that tension prior to engaging in these more sort of forceful practices. Otherwise one runs the risk of simply masking the cause of the restricted breathing temporarily, whilst at the same time reinforcing the cause by adding tension upon tension. So yes, often I think you're pointing to there in these certain practices of sexual yoga, often people will go straight away to the doing part, the mechanical part, the locks and etc. and the holds of various kinds, and that's fine and good. But if one hasn't, in a certain sense, prepared the body, made the body conductive and open and relaxed habitual tension, secondary tension patterns, and so on, then it can be a bit like driving with the handbrake on. Basically, it can be a little like that.
Yeah, and that is what I was talking about, and that's very much true when people go into sexual yoga practice. Particularly, one of the ways that we see it a lot, of course, is when people start clenching the pelvic floor and tensing the perineum and doing all these things to direct energy away from orgasm or towards orgasm. And with that, they are reinforcing tension and often trauma patterns that are already in the body. A lot of people are chronically pulled up in their tension in their pelvic floor, men and women alike, right? And they are chronically overworked in those areas. And then if you do Kegels or if you do very specific locks in the body for sexual yoga or also for regular yoga, you're often just exacerbating a condition. And while you might have a temporary result, it's not advisable in the long run. So that's why I think working with these locks passively by giving the body a chance to regulate itself and learning to trust the natural ability, the natural genius of the body, and working with relaxation rather than with tension is much more sustainable, and it's also much easier, which is something that I'm really quite insistent on in any time, I work with women on sexual pleasure, because as as we age and as we go through a very stressful life, pelvic floor health, right, and understanding the muscles and understanding the energetics and the locks and all of that in the pelvic floor really makes or breaks a lot of different areas of life, not just full body orgasms, but also, your sexual health, your ability to age well, the way you have intercourse, there's all kinds of things that play into that, because that entire domain is an energy body in itself. And so I would say, as much as possible, there has to be first understanding and knowledge of that area and exploration, and then relaxation and really understanding what influences what. And, there's all these layers in the pelvic floor that when you understand what's actually happening, just by knowing that, your pleasure potential is just enormous suddenly. And that's not even talking about vaginal versus, clitoral or things like that. We're just talking the pool of energy and blood and sensation in the pelvic floor that can be explored. So I think it's really advisable to first learn about the area and find out where's tension patterns, where might be injury, where it's weak spots and things of that nature, and really engage with the area as a area of huge potential, and not start by clenching or working with locks as a beginning stage, but really go kind of on an exploration and a fact-finding mission of what is actually needed before applying rote technique. So that's where I would start, and that's where we always suggest somebody starts, is exploration, a fact-finding mission, a getting to know one's own body, developing trust in one's own body before forcing certain things or using technique that isn't grounded in proper preparation.
What advice would you have, perhaps to end, for somebody who wants to embark on that exploratory journey?
So if somebody listens to this and has never engaged with that entire area, I think it's a twofold approach. And the first one is to become aware of the tension patterns in the lower body, and to explore, the lower body and the pelvic floor as an area of, just huge potential, and an area of huge potential sensual and sexual availability. And so how to do that first is, anybody can do that exactly where they are when listening to this, is to really feel in that area and notice if there's areas of tension, areas of clench. Is there pain? Is there numbness? Maybe you can't feel anything, or is it very alive? So, and that area is roughly right between, let's say, the hip bones, the pubic bone, and then all the way back to the, to the sacrum, and the entire kind of muscular area in between, so the pelvic bowl. And then, of course, there's the sex organs and the sphincter of the anus and things like that. Also, the large muscles of the buttocks and the thighs. All that area can hold tension or not. And just playing with that is quite interesting. Also quite interesting is isolating, clenching and releasing. So just clenching both thighs and then releasing them, clenching both buttocks and releasing them. When you do that, you'll know, I'm doing it as we're speaking, right? You can feel your whole body pulls up, and then relaxing that. And then isolating the perineum, and then, isolating different areas within the sex organs. So there's a lot that can be done just without ever even touching oneself. And then when we walk, or when we are actually engaged sexually, self-pleasure, or with somebody else, noticing areas that feel numb or tight, that feel closed, painful, or open and really, conductive, and really mapping that area. I think it's also really important. And finally, there is, you barely ever could find good depictions of the pelvic floor, but now the anatomy books have that, and you can also find it, online, to really look at where those layers of the pelvic floor attach to the certain bones and things like that. Because when you understand how it all hangs together, it's really fascinating, and it's super useful. The way the uterus is held within that system, for instance, right? Where the ovaries sit, how the sacrum, when somebody has a, like a painful period, what happens, how that's all connected. When you understand that, then engagements like using a sex toy or a wand, or even, some people go and have their pelvic floor worked on by a physical therapist, or, somebody who's specialized in that. Anybody who is really good at that, by the way, will give somebody a really good education, right? And says, okay, press here. Can you feel how this connects to this bone? Or press down on your pubic bone. What can you feel internally? So you really get sensitized to that area. For sexual health, also empowerment, right? There's a huge empowerment in the sense that when you know what's happening down there, men and women alike, you don't have to listen to people who tell you something that's not entirely right, or their agenda. And there's a lot of agenda in sexual health and in pleasure, and even in the tantric domains. It's lots and lots of agenda, and not a lot of, particularly in women's health, you barely ever get the facts. You get this tinted information that's skewed medically or scientifically or spiritually or dogmatically, or all of the above. So knowledge is in fact power, and it's also the fuel and the kind of the rocket fuel for the full body orgasm, and the fuel for really having an alive sexual engagement with oneself, and then hopefully with another in that way. So that's where I would start. And then also, of course, we'll maybe talk about this in the next episode: tools, sex toys, practices you can do to actually engage with the more sexual aspect, waking up, the internal organs and the internal layers vaginally, and, and all of that. So that's, I think, that should be our next conversation.
Oh, excellent. Well, that was very interesting indeed. Thank you, Michaela.
Thank you, Steve.